It's great to be back. And your theme, creating creators, I think is an important theme, particularly now in the space that we're in, and that there's so much happening in our world, so much happening in our society, that the ability for us to create spaces that allow us to reimagine the world that we want to create is so important. And so I'm honored to be able to share these ideas with you, and to be able to really create a different way to think about our own leadership as we focus this summer on creating creators and beyond. Um, I'm here in Chicago, and so I'm in a hotel room. So if you hear a siren or something, don't worry, it's not an emergency. It's just there's a lot of noise on the street. So there's a couple things I want to say before I get started. The first thing I want to say is, I think much of our work, working with families, working with young people, I think sometimes in school and out of school time as leaders, we come up with really good solutions to the wrong problem. And what I mean by that is sometimes we think the problem is, the problem to improve our delivery to young people is more funding. We think it is if we had, if young people would just show up on time, if we had better parent engagement, and we come up with solutions sometimes to the wrong problems. And so today I want to talk to you about not what we want from our young people, not what we want from students, not even what we want from our colleagues that we work with. I'm going to be talking about you today and the kind of changes that we need to make as leaders, as creators, so that we can actually create the space of imagination and create the space that we need, particularly at this time, to sort of birth the new world that is waiting for us. And I think that so much of our time is spent problem solving, that we haven't spent enough time imagining and dreaming of the kind of communities, after school programs, and society that we want. I know that this is it's supposed to be a keynote, right? But I just want to talk to y'all, right? I just want to have a conversation today. And so I don't want you to think of it as so much as a formal keynote, though I have a PowerPoint that I will put up, but it doesn't have a lot of slides. And that's because I really want to talk to you and have a conversation with you about the ideas that are in the book, but also how these ideas might enhance, deepen, and expand your work with young people in school and out of school. And I think the place to start is, I like to start with a story, of course, and I'm going to share my screen. I like to start with sharing a little bit about myself, and then how I come to think about these pivots that I'll talk about. And the story begins with, it's really a story about my mama. When I was a young boy, I grew up outside of Los Angeles in Southern California. And when I was young, me and my brothers would play in the backyard, and we would we'd be playing in the backyard in the hot summer days. And my mother grew up in a town called Trenton, Florida. And she would always share these stories with us about this little beautiful home that she grew up in, with a creek in the back and a mango tree. And she would tell us stories about how she would climb the mango tree, and how she would allow us to, she would bring her friends into the backyard. She would also share stories about this little creek near her house, and how that creek had lightning bugs that floated over. In the evenings, you could see the sort of light bugs floating over the pond. We were enchanted by that story and those stories that she would share with us. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I had an opportunity to visit Trenton, Florida with my mother. And my mother, She was so proud. She took me around to all my cousins' houses. And I wanted to see the little house that she grew up in. And so we went from cousin to cousin, sat on the couches with the plastic covers on them. Y'all know what I'm talking about. And it got late in the day. And so finally she said, let me show you the house that I grew up in. And I became so excited that finally I was going to see this little house that my mother had shared with me in her childhood. So we walked to the end of the road and took a left, and we were on a dirt road. And in the South, in Trenton, Florida, in the South, there are these big trees that canopy these roads with moss that hangs down from the trees. And it was enchanting and it was beautiful. We walked down that road in silence. And as the sun was setting, I looked over to my left and I saw a little creek. And sure enough, there were these lightning bugs floating around around the creek. And I came so excited. I'm gonna get ready to see the house that my mother had always talked about. And so we continued to walk down the road, and she said, "We're here." And she turned, and as we turned and saw the house, she began to smile, but I began to almost cry, because this is what I saw. I wasn't prepared for seeing this house. It was the first time that I realized how poor my mother had grown up. And my mother showed me this house, and she saw that I was getting emotional, but she saw something entirely different. She brought me into this little house, and she showed me all the little nooks and crannies. And she said, "Look, this is where we would keep the number 10 tub." And I didn't know what a number 10 tub is, just like y'all probably don't know what a number 10 tub. It was a tub that they used to bathe in, and they pour hot water and they would bathe in. And she showed me where the stove was. And it was just a little shack. And she saw that I was getting deeply emotional, because for the first time I realized how poor my mother had grown up. And she turned to me and she said something that I'll never forget. She said, why are you sad, son?" I said, "Mom, I didn't know you had grown up with such poverty." And she said, "Don't be sad, son. It was in this house when I was a child that I dreamed of you. And I dreamed and imagined that one day you would come back here to see my roots and to see how I grew up. And so your returning to this house is a fulfillment of my dreams. And this is a moment of celebration in it for both of us." And when she said that, it shifted me. And I realized that for my mother, while she deeply understood poverty, she was not defined by it. That she knew that her imagination and that her ability to build relationships with her family and friends, she recognized that her capacity to see the possibilities in life really were created opportunities for her to create me. And so that experience, I learned a few things. Right? I learned that our ability to do deep reflection is important. I learned that the quality, the depth of our relationships with our friends and families and colleagues are significant and important. I realized that that oftentimes, even when things get challenging, you still have to have the capacity to see the possibilities, even when it's tough. And then I also realized that I needed to slow down to appreciate the precious treasures that life has to offer. And the book is really based on when I did not use those lessons, when I did not reflect, when I didn't cultivate deep relationships, when I focused on problems instead of possibility, and when I was in frenzy and hustle mode all the time. And so the 4 pivots are really about these lessons that I learned when I veered away from the lessons that my mother gave me. For over 30 years, I've worked in communities, I've worked in organizations, I've worked with young people, I've worked with families. And I think that sometimes we forget the essence, the deep meaning of our work. And that this book is really designed, it's really written for those of us who seek change, but somehow have lost ourselves in that process. A friend of mine said not long ago that we are all worthy and a little broken. And that sometimes our engagement with trying to create justice, we forget that there are simple rules that it's important for us to take care of ourselves. And in that process, we create and the ability for us to create a new society and a new world. And so the question is why do we need to pivot? You know, what changes do we need to be making and why is that important? And we know that all the issues that we face in this society are ongoing. We saw what just happened in New York, in upstate New York, in Buffalo. We see that there are ongoing movements for Black and Asian lives, and we recognize that unfortunately, our cities are continuing to experience ongoing violence from school shootings to shootings in parks. I'm here in Chicago. There was just a shooting at a park among young people. And we also know that we're not out of the pandemic, and that stress, that uncertainty, that all these issues requires us to have a different set of tools that gives us the insight, but also the power to execute and create and change our society and our schools. And so these issues aren't going away. But sometimes I know that in my training, I haven't been given all the tools necessary to be able to navigate these ongoing issues that continue to confront our families and confront our young people. So the book is like a compass. It's like a moral and ethical compass that allows us to think more deeply about our own journey so that we can create the path to the destination that we want to achieve. We can't assume that the way that we continue, you know, I've heard people talk about, we just need to get back to normal. If we could just get back to the way things used to be before the pandemic. And I'm not so sure that should be the goal that we should be aspiring. And in fact, there's evidence that suggests that many of us were tired and had high levels of anxiety, high teacher turnover, high rates of stress even before the pandemic. So the question is if this is the direction that we need to go, how do we go? How do we move forward in this direction? And what does it take for us to create these pivots and changes within us that allows for us to have a profound impact on our work? And so I call these the 4 pivots, because a pivot is subtle, something that you do that's subtle change in direction that over time has a significant impact. This is a pivot of a basketball player. You know, one foot is in one position, and that one foot that is planted allows for that basketball player to change an entire direction. It's different than a shift or a change. A change takes work, takes a lot of energy. A change means you have to take mental effort and physical effort to stop what you're doing and pick up something that you're not used to, and then continue to do that. A change is effort, takes a lot of effort, but a pivot can be effortless. Think about a pivot that we all made as a society in the 1970s. In the 1970s, we would all take our garbage and we would put it all in one can. And then in the late 70s, there was a movement to separate our garbage from our recycling. And we created recycling. And it's something that we take for granted. You know, the bottle that you have in front of you right now, the sandwich that you're eating or whatever right now, when you throw that away, you're going to make a decision to put one in one place and the recycling in another. Well, that was a pivot, a very subtle thing that we do day in, day out, that over time has a profound and extraordinary impact on our environment. So I think that these pivots, even though we practice these pivots on an individual basis, and sometimes we have practiced them in teams, over time have a significant impact on our quest and our journey for justice. So there are 4 pivots. And the first pivot I call the pivot from lens to mirror, the pivot from lens to mirror. And a lens is an analysis, right? And lens is the sort of outward look, the sort of external issues that we're always pointing at. A lens gives us an explanation about why students perform less well in school than their counterparts. A lens gives us an explanation about why there's poverty. A lens gives us an explanation about why there are teacher shortages. A lens is an important tool, but it is an incomplete tool because we also need a mirror. And a mirror is the deep reflection about who we are or what issues that we need to resolve in our own lives and questions that allows us to be more fully human. Mirror work is a lot harder, y'all, than lens work. Lens work allows us to do the analysis and look outward, but mirror work implicates us. It asks questions about what do I need to work on to be better. A friend of mine in the book I interviewed a friend of mine. He said, he put it best when he said, you know, sometimes when we work for justice, we always ask the wrong question. And the wrong question is always, what do I need to do? And he suggests that that's the wrong question, but the right question is, who do I need to become? And so mirror work is that deeper reflection. It asks ourselves, forces us to ask questions about who we are and what are our motivations? What do I need to heal from? What are my insecurities? And it allows us to actually become the people that we actually need to become in order to create the outcome that we desire. My own lens work came from an experience that I had this is during the pandemic when the stores were open again. I went to a neighborhood store. I live in a working class neighborhood in Oakland, California. And this is the store that's kind of, it's kind of a low-end store that has, groceries, but it's a place where families go to stock up on food. It's not a high-end, like Whole Foods. It ain't that. It's like the opposite of Whole Foods. And when I go there, the lines are always long. You got to wait. The checkers are sometimes rude, but the people are always, the people that go there are neighborhood people, and so they're always friendly. So I went to the grocery store and I was in line, a long line, and the line wasn't moving. The line wasn't moving because someone was using their federal assistance to buy their groceries. And I was getting frustrated, right? I was getting frustrated and like, why do people stand in this line? And why do people take the time? Why don't people just leave? And so I got my stuff, my basket, and I began to just put stuff back when it occurred to me I needed to do some mirror work. When I did some mirror work, I began to reflect on my own class privilege. I asked myself the question, why don't people just leave and go to the store, the more affluent store where their lines are shorter? When I realized as I did mirror work, well, maybe people here don't have cars or they don't have access to private transportation like you do. Maybe they came here on a bus, and maybe they have a very limited budget, and that this store provides them the opportunity to stock up on food and not have to worry about food for the next couple of weeks. That I began to reflect on my class privilege, and that my class privilege shaped and informed my frustration about what I saw. And so that's something I needed to work on, right? And so I decided to stay. I decided to talk to people, and yes, we were a little frustrated, but that mirror work gives us the opportunity to ask ourselves questions that we typically don't engage in. And mirror work is tough. Here's a question. This is how most of us typically are, right? This is how most of the world is, right? I like this meme. It's not a good copy. I know it's a little blurry for y'all. I got it off my own Twitter account. But it says, how am I supposed to lose weight if everything tastes good? In other words, I don't have any agency, or I don't have any power over things in my life, right? That mirror work allows us to interrogate this sort of mindset. How am I, we could rephrase this sentence. How am I supposed to support young people when? How am I supposed to support teachers when? How am I supposed to have a good after school program when? How am I supposed to be a teacher artist when? In other words, mirror work, that's lens work, right? Lens work is sort of outward looking, but the lens work, or mirror work, allows us to reflect on ourselves so that we don't end up with this phrase in our life: how am I supposed to lose weight if everything tastes good? Here's a question that we could begin to explore what mirror work looks like. Who do I have to become to create the outcome that I want? That's a question. Some of you might be asking, well, what is the outcome I want? Another question could be, what is my highest aspiration? What do I aspire to do and be? And how are my actions and behaviors consistent with that aspiration? Mirror work forces us to look inward and ask ourselves the questions that allows us to be better at what we do. The second pivot is a pivot from transactional relationships to transformative relationships. And we know that from research that there are two types of relationships. The transactional relationships are relationships that are defined by role, position, authority, right? And then there are transformative relationships. And these relationships are informed by perceived vulnerability and trust and care. And we know from research that transformative relationships are really the only relationships that matter. That once you are able to cultivate these transformative relationships, that they create a significant difference, or they create a significant difference in your ability to move in a different direction. I was a board chair at the California Endowment, which is a large endowment, large foundation in California. And that, as a chairman of that board, our board of directors largely operated in a transactional way. Many of them were doctors of hospitals. Some of them were, medical. They were medical. They headed up hospitals and large medical facilities. And we entered those board meetings with our titles, with our position, with our authority, and they were very transactional. But as the chair, I wanted to change. I wanted to move. I wanted to cultivate more transformative relationships. And so I decided to do something that no board chair has ever done before. I decided to move the boardroom tables. And I asked the board members we removed the names off the boardroom so that we didn't have to lead by our titles. Our names weren't there. And we sat in a circle. And in that circle, we shared our story. And it took 2 or 3 hours, but we shared our stories about who we are, about our insecurities, about our trust. And I learned from those board members. I learned so much in that session and how we moved forward. I learned that many of them had been adopted. I learned that many of them had traumatic experiences growing up in the South, and had I learned that many of them had issues with intimacy and care. But when we shared and told our stories, it allowed for us to form these transformative relationships, so that as a board, we were able to go deep and wide in our work together. We were able to allocate millions of dollars to Black and Brown communities, and we were able to really be explicit about our issue and our focus on racial inequality. Creating the space for transformative relationships are not important just because it's based in research, and we know that, but we also know that it's important as a function of our own well-being and our collective well-being. And this is why I caution people to only use the term self-care, because self-care presumes that there's sort of like self-indulgent care, and that, if I'm well, it's all good. But I also want to encourage us to think more broadly about collective care. And collective care comes from my own ancestral knowledge, and it also comes from indigenous knowledge, which is that care is a collective process. That means that my well-being is connected to the well-being of those that I am connected to. It's connected to my community, to my family. And so if I'm sick, we are all sick. Or if I'm well, we are all well. And so in our capacity to cultivate these transformative relationships, it also facilitates a sense of well-being that's important for our collective capacity to make the changes that we want. The third pivot is a pivot from problem to possibility, a pivot from problem to possibility. And this pivot is an important pivot because oftentimes we are so focused on addressing and solving problems in our day-to-day life. And we know that it's important to focus on problems. But problem solving is also a function of oppression, right? That oppression limits and shapes and dictates what we can focus on. And when we, I always tell my graduate students that the greatest consequence of oppression is not blocked opportunities, but it is the destruction of our capacity to dream beyond it. And so as a result, the most courageous way that we think about addressing oppression is that we only use the term anti. So we use anti-racism as an example, or anti-racist, which is an important process. But when we define our outcome in connection to the thing that we want to eliminate, we are still connected to that. We're still connected to that issue. We're still connected to it. It's still addressing the problem, but not being able to see and imagine beyond that problem. Much of our work has been focused on engaging in problem solving and not as much on possibility creating, and thinking about and giving ourselves the permission to imagine and dream. Now, I know as teaching artists, and I know as creators, that you spend a lot of time in this important space in our work for justice and our work for transformative change. But possibility creation is also rooted in research that suggests that our well-being is connected in our ability to see a possible future. And then the extent to which we could actually see a desired possible future facilitates a sense of well-being because we have the perception that there's some sense of control over that. And so when we cultivate creativity and we create opportunities to dream and imagine, we are again facilitating a sense of individual and collective well-being that allows us to drive the kind of change that we want to see. I first learned about this pivot, not from research, however. I first learned about this in a group of young men that I was working with who had all experienced some form of trauma. These young men came to my healing group with sexual abuse, violence. Some of them had used weapons. 2 or 3 of them were homeless. And every Wednesday night at the community college in my house, we would sit and I would have them recount their experience with trauma. My intent was to get them to connect their trauma with their current behavior. And Wednesday night after Wednesday night, they would do this. When one Wednesday night, Marcus, a young man in the group, stopped and said, you may have read this in my my article, The Future of Healing, Shifting from Trauma-Informed Care to Healing-Centered Engagement. Marcus said, Dr. Ginwright, I like coming here in, every Wednesday night, but why do we always have to talk about the worst thing that happened to us? I'm more than the worst thing that happened to me. I'm more than just my trauma. I want to talk about the fact that I want to open up, a coffee shop. And I really want to, serve coffee I want to have a coffee shop near the school. And when he said that, the other young men perked up. They said, yeah, I want to open up my own t-shirt shop, man. And another young man said, you know what? I want to create my own sneaker line. And they all began to shift the conversation to their dreams, what they had imagined. Now, I wasn't prepared for that. They had literally taken over the session, and I wasn't prepared for it. And I was puzzled, and I was curious about what had just occurred. These young men were talking about their dreams and their imagination. When I went back to think about how I was trained, I recognized that much of my training around trauma-informed approaches did not see the assets in young people. And I think that sometimes we, if we're not careful, we use a problem approach to thinking about young people instead of possibilities, looking at their assets. So who knows what this is? Let me see if I can see this in chat. My window is closed. Okay, here's what we're gonna do right now. Y'all ready? Okay. I wish I could see y'all, but this is cool. The webinar, doing this by webinar is a little weird because I can't see nobody. But anyway, all right, we're ready. Thank you, Leila. This is, so when I was a kid, okay, Laquita Shaw, thank you for saying that. And Joe Patterson, thank you. But when I was a kid, I don't know how old y'all are, but you're probably younger than I am. We used to have to get a pocket full of quarters and go to a place to play arcade games. Like not we had to actually go there. So this is an arcade. So if you're old enough to remember playing these games, what I want you to do in chat right now is put your favorite game you used to play in chat right now. All right, Pac-Man, Centipede, Miss Pac-Man. Oh, a lot of Pac-Man, Frogger, okay. Street Fighter, that's a new one. Oh, that's a new one. Street Fighter is new. Mortal Kombat is actually new. Galaxia, that's mine. Donkey Kong, all right. Pac-Man, all right, good. Asteroids, that was my favorite too. All right. All right, so I'm glad to see, oh, Miss Pac-Man was good. Mario Brothers, pinball. Come on, Jessica. Come on, you old school, pinball. All right, good. Thank you for putting this in, all right? So here's the next question. Okay, y'all can stop doing the games now. All right, here's the next question. You remember that game where you had these little hammers, and there would be a little mole would pop up, and you would hit it, boom, 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 boom. It's called whack-a-mole, right? Yeah, whack-a-mole. So that was one of my favorite games, playing whack-a-mole. And I used to love playing whack-a-mole because you try to guess where the next mole would pop up, you try to hit it. And if you think about the game whack-a-mole, that is kind of what problem solving and problem thinking is like. It's like we're always consistently solving problems. And when we're constantly playing that game of whack-a-mole, we're not using our mind to create the kinds of possibilities that we need to change our society and support our young people. So when we make the shift to possibility, we ask different questions about who we are, different questions about what's possible. And we really try to focus on creating that type of possibility and creating spaces for young people to dream and imagine. One way to dream and imagine is, I've already asked you this question, is if you could write 3 things that your life would look like 10 years from now, what would you write? If that piece of paper was that you're going to write on is a magic piece of paper, and you wrote those 3 things down, and magically in 10 years that it would appear, what would those 3 things be? What I have found is that most of the time, unfortunately, it's hard for us to answer that question. We haven't given ourselves the permission or giving ourselves the space to answer the questions about our own future possibility. So the next pivot, all right, I'm sorry. So oftentimes our focus on problem solving is enshrined in the words that we have, right? The words that we use. And so I did this activity with my graduate students. And I asked them to talk about their work. And here's what they said about their work. You know, I demand the rights of parents to be in classrooms. I fight for justice for young people. I confront white supremacy in schools. I defend the rights of the homeless. I resist police violence and police harassment. These words on I don't know if the left or right, but the confined words are important words, but they're incomplete without the open words. And so there are other words that we could use to describe our work. And again, I know that I'm talking to creators here. And so these words on the open words, you probably use more frequently than some of the audiences that I typically talk to, which is dream and imagine and create and design and play and invent, right? All of these words are critically important, and they enshrine in there a signal when we can recognize when we're using these words in our work. The last and final pivot is a pivot from hustle to flow. And this is a tough pivot for most of us, because most of us, it's almost like a fish that's swimming in water. If you ask a fish, what do you swim in? They don't know what water is. It's just in our environment. In our environment, our water is hustle. Our water is frenzy. And our frenzy, we have an addiction to frenzy that comes from capitalist culture that defines a human being by what a human being can produce or earn. And as a result, we've been digesting this idea that all we could do is hustle, and all we could do is engage in this, I call it an addiction to frenzy, because we believe that the busier we are, the more worth we have as individuals. Let me prove it for a second. I can't see you, but just put in chat, raise your hand or something, put in chat if you have a to-do list. Just put yes or something so I can see if you hear me. Yeah, if you have a to-do list. So there's everybody on here should probably, I suspect, has a to-do list. Now, once you complete something on your to-do list, what's the first thing you do? You cross something off that you completed, and then you add 3 more things back on it, right? In other words, you don't finish your to-do list. You add stuff on it as you cross it off. And that's a symptom of our addiction to frenzy. That's a symptom of our ongoing desire to always fill up our work or fill up our days with frenzy and hustle, this sense of hustle. Now, I'm not talking about the kind of hustle that my father did. My father had to work 3 jobs to send me to college. My father had to work, right? And that structurally, right, if we look at the capitalist economy, he shouldn't have had to do that either. So institutionally and societally, my father had to hustle because he had to earn, and he had to work multiple jobs to earn. But I'm also talking about the kind of frenzy we get into, this idea that our time needs to be spent and filled up. So this last pivot means that we pivot from hustle to flow. And flow is an intentional separation and an acknowledgement of when we're in frenzy. The first step to flow is recognizing we're in frenzy. Most of it, it's like asking the fish, what do you swim in? We don't even recognize we're in frenzy because we deeply believe that this is just how it is. It ain't how it is, your family. We can go to other countries that the culture slows down. You could go to Spain and they have siestas. In our Western society, we believe that this ongoing frenzy is adequate enough for us to make deep change, and it is not. Flow means that we set more realistic deadlines for ourselves. Flow means that we don't take on so much and then regret that we took on that other assignment. Flow means that we find intentional time in our day or our week to slow down. Flow might mean that you actually, at the end of a busy day, you might take an inventory of your emotions. I always give people the assignment at the end of a day, just write down the number of emotions, write down all the emotions you experienced, and then use those emotions to then track which emotions were feeding you and which emotions were draining you. And then begin to do those things that feed you and try to eliminate the things that drain your emotions. So this last pivot from hustle to flow gives us the permission, gives us the ability to slow down and to have more deeper, meaningful engagement with ourselves and with the people that we care about. I first realized that I was in frenzy when I was on a speaking circuit, ongoing, and I had a smooth routine to catch a 7 o'clock flight every single week. When one morning I woke up, took a shower, and my dog was, I could see the dog wanted to get out of the house to go to the bathroom. And so I was the only one in the house. And I hopped out of the shower and I slipped and fell and hit the corner of the step with my ribs. And I was laying on the floor and this is what I saw. I wish I could hear y'all laugh because it wasn't funny. Now, y'all remember Lassie? I wished at that moment that my dog was like Lassie because I was the only one in the house at 5 a.m. And I needed the dog Lassie to go make a phone call to somebody that can come help me because I couldn't move. I literally couldn't get up. And so I was just struggling. My first thought was, I can still make the flight. I can still make the flight. I can still make the flight. I couldn't make the flight. I crawled over to the edge of my bed and was able to get to my cell phone. I called my wife, 5 a.m. You could guess what she said. What's wrong? She called the ambulance. They came and got me and took me to the hospital. And I found that I had broken 3 ribs and fractured a vertebrae. All because I was in frenzy. I was doing all this, trying to catch a flight on a routine. And I wasn't conscious and aware that I was in frenzy. Now that was on March 13th, 2020. And on March 15th, 2020, the entire world shut down and rested with me. On that day, March 15th, you didn't go to work. You were forced to slow down because the entire world slowed down. You read books for the first time. You took up gardening for the first time. You watched TV shows for the first time. You got bored in your house for the first time, but you also cultivated relationships, right? So this last pivot from hustle to flow allows us to slow down and create the kind of conditions that we need. I want to end with this quote from Michelle Alexander. She says that Michelle Alexander is an amazing legal scholar. And she said that I'm not practicing law anymore. And that the reason I'm not practicing law is because at its core, America's problems, its political and policy problems, raise moral and spiritual questions about who we are and who we aim to become and what we're willing to do about it now. Thank you so much, Kix. I want to make sure we have some time for questions so that we can just kind of have a conversation now. So thanks for listening.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ginwright. Wow, we were like here off camera on mute, like doing all our snaps and all of that. I know all of our friends here in chat were doing the same thing. A lot of activity and affirmation to what you were saying. And so I do want to leave the floor open for any Q&A, maybe even any comments. Feel free to use the Q&A chat for that. So we have Jermaine who's giving us a question on how do you exercise possibility creation in a world of problems? referencing to pivot 3. So again, how do you exercise possibility creation in a world full of problems?
Yeah. Yeah. Solving. So some people misunderstand that I'm saying, oh, we should stop solving problems. No, we should absolutely. There's a lot of problems that we need to be solved. It's just that solving problems is not the only thing we should be focusing on. So the question is, how do we solve problem? How do we create possibilities in the world of problems? Is we ask ourselves different questions, right? We literally ask ourselves different questions. We ask ourselves questions about what might be possible here? How might I create a different alternative? What is how do we think different? How can we think differently about this issue, right? So in the book, The Four Pivots, there are some questions that guide people to think about how to create possibilities even when things are challenging. I refer back to my mama in the opening story, that my mother understood oppression. She had a lot of problems, but she wasn't defined by it. And so our ability to see the possibilities, even if they don't exist, right? Nelson Mandela and when he was in prison, still had a vision of a democratic South Africa, right? And so when we can begin to have conversations about what we want to see, about what we imagine, it allows for us to manifest that in our life. And if we work together, we can create it.
Thank you. That's like, I mean, like so in alignment with how we're moving forward here at Big Thought with this idea of creating creators and this like creator archetype, and that is resonates with us so much. We do have a question from Sherry Cook where she is asking, any suggestions for how to put these pivots into practice in a summer camp? So a lot of our providers here are in youth development, and summer camp is part of their large scope of work. So how can they incorporate these pivots into a summer camp? Any suggestions?
Yeah, well, two ways. One, I would encourage the adult staff that's running and operating and sort of designing the summer camp to use the four pivots. So do you have time? Do you create space for mirror work in your staff meetings? Are you using possibility thinking? Are you creating deep relationships? So that's the first thing, is to practice those pivots with the adult staff. And then secondly, with the young people, how much time do you create in your day or your week for the young people to practice reflection, asking questions, maybe you're having them draw something about themselves that people don't know. Give them opportunities to have deeper relationships and allow them to share their stories with one another. You could use and design activities that are consistent with each of these four pivots. And those four pivots can actually serve as the sort of architecture for your summer programming.
Thank you. So we do have a question from Joe Patterson saying, when you do realize that you have the wrong perspective, what are some things we can do to make those pivots without throwing everyone around you for a loop, like building the plane while you're flying it? So let me restate that again. When do you realize that you have the wrong perspective? What are some of the things that we can do to make those pivots without throwing everyone around for a loop?
Yeah. So I think first you individually have to try to practice the pivots, right? That this is not something that you change your whole organization, but try those pivots I give people a 30-day diet or a 30-day pivot plan, right? So try the four pivots on today or tomorrow. Try to engage in 5 minutes of self-reflection. How am I feeling today? What do I need to work on? What am I learning about myself? One question is, what have you learned about yourself in the last 30 days, right? Try to practice those pivots yourself. It's not that we try to change everyone else. The point is that we actually try to use those practices and those pivots with ourselves first. Again, in the book, there are a number of activities and questions that guide the readers, that guide you through some questions that allows for you to actually implement these in your own practices.
Thank you. So we have from Anita from To Inspire Peace. She asks, how do you keep the need to survive or hustle from distracting you from flowing or creating your dreams?
Yeah, great question. As I said, my father had to hustle, right? He had to work multiple jobs. Um, I think the question is like, at what point are you in frenzy? When you're in frenzy when you feel like you're over committed, exhausted, and you're trying to move north and south at the same time, right? So I think the important part is like recognize when you have so much to do that it immobilizes you, right? That you can't do anything. And there's such a move and there's such an effort in our work to get things done really quickly. But sometimes we need to set more realistic deadlines for ourselves. And so you may have to work. You might have to take on multiple jobs, right? That's a reality of this context that we live in. But flow is, okay, how am I going to claim and reclaim and demand my time? It might just mean you could take 5 minutes for yourself. It might mean 10 minutes, right? It might mean today I have the right to sleep in an extra 15 minutes, right? Or you might have children, or you might be caretaking, right? And that's a huge responsibility. Even in that context, you could still find 5 minutes for yourself, right? Just find some space that you're able to restore yourself, even if it's 5 to 10 minutes. It's micro acts that over time begin to contribute to an overall a picture of what we want to become.